Hi ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I'm now extremely pleased to introduce a familiar face to the conference, who's also been the moderator of the panel discussion that we just had, Dr. Jon-Hans Coetzer. Dr. Coetzer is the General Manager of the Geneva School of Diplomacy. He has worked extensively in managerial positions in countries around the world in sectors crossing academia, the third and private sector. Prior to being appointed to his current position, he worked for 4 years as National Marketing Manager for the ICRC, and he later spent another 4 years representing the international community of the Red Cross as a regional communication delegate in 15 countries, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, Afghanistan, and Thailand. Extending into independent research and managerial positions, Dr. Coetzer worked in a number of positions in France before beginning his PhD at the Geneva School of Diplomacy, where he researched into optimizing diplomatic training for the developing world. Since 2009, Dr. Coetzer has served as the General Manager at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jon-Hans Coetzer.
Thank you very much. More of me. Ladies and gentlemen, I've decided to take the format of a formal lecture simply because you have clearly seen that we've tried to take a hugely complicated dimensions of sustainability, development, and culture, and we try to, and which is very eminent from your questions, is just the complexity of what should constitute this frame. So I thought, when Mark approached me and he said, Jon-Hans, I would very much like you to talk about innovative strategies for the future and success of sustainable policies. And I thought long and hard, and because as you clearly have seen, I'm somebody who likes to speak freely. And as I was starting to prepare myself, I thought to be able to do justice and to add value to your participation, I would like to try and give you an overview of the complexity and how I see the successes and the failures, but certainly the opportunities specifically for the implementation of policies. The policies that we've heard, the very passionate contribution that we had from Madame was very much about equity and a real commitment, a democratic commitment. Doesn't matter how minor that flickering of optimism is currently burning. But we've also seen how we tend to focus the debate from a very profitable, profitable business, or we look at communities and we look at rural communities, as I try to illustrate in this caricature of the presentation. And then we also saw how quickly we say we look at governments. Governments, it's your responsibility. And as we heard, but hang on, is there not an outcry about the reintroduction of coal? And through my lecture, I will weave into it some names of the most seminal, most influential seminal authors and what they stand for. So, ladies and gentlemen, for me, I believe that culture it's not sufficient to look at culture as the fourth pillar to be integrated into the well-settled notion of sustainable development. Rather, it is a basis for integrating the meaning and the practice of sustainable development at its epistemic core. Thus, it is important for us to take stock of the culture of sustainable development as it is practiced today. The area of culture has grown in salience in global development issues on account of the rising share of cultural goods, services, and intellectual property in world trade, as well as the threats to cultural diversities and identities associated with contemporary globalization. Also, there is an increasing awareness that the protection and promotion of cultural diversity is vital to the universal human rights, the fundamental freedoms, along with securing ecological and genetic diversity. This standpoint is premised on the view that sustainable development is only achievable if there is harmony and a direct alignment between the objectives of cultural diversity and that of social equity, environmental responsibility, and economic viability. The aim of my presentation is to elaborate on the notion of culture as the fourth pillar of sustainable development, along with the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. The key premise of the presentation is that culture is more than just the manifestations of culture. For example, the arts. And instead, it should be viewed as the whole social order. From this perspective, even the construct of sustainable development needs to be interrogated because particular conceptions of the global social order are prioritized in its various interpretations as it is applied in the various geographical contexts. My presentation will therefore examine both the culture of sustainable development in terms of how it has evolved as a global agenda and how the cultural arena can be facilitated by the construct of sustainable development. In this way, the presentation operates from the methodological standpoint that it is the meaning of sustainability in the different contexts to which it's being applied that should be our central concern. Let's just briefly look at how we came to the current knowledge construct, the paradigm of sustainable development in the global context. Well, it really entered the development discourse in the early 1970s with the UN Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. And that's most probably argued to be the first conference that brought the concept of sustainability to the international arena. However, there is general consensus in the literature that it was the 1987 World Commission on Environment and Development that was largely responsible for providing the normative conceptual bridge between environmental concerns and development outcomes, hence sustainable development. These conferences, the Earth Summit that took place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and the Agenda 21 facilitated the globalization of the concept and the establishment of an international consensus and a discourse on the concept of sustainable development by the formulation of action plans and guidelines. Meadowcroft described it as the, quote, sweeping nature of this ideonational construct, unquote, which presents us with a variety of definitions that have been conferred on the concept of sustainable development. However, the most popularly employed definition, arguably, is the one of the contained in the Brundtland report, and it says, sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But there is another often quoted definition presented to us by Caring for the Earth, quote, improving the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. So here clearly, ladies and gentlemen, we can see the main emphasis is placed on an environmentalist dimension. Among the multiplicity of dimensions and interpretation, there is a general view that identifies ecological and the environmental factors as the limiting factor on development, because it limits it to these two constructs and it does not look beyond, it does not include the other dimensions. At the core of these views is the notion of an intertemporal conflict of interest between the development practices of present generations and the perceived needs and capabilities of future generations. Critical to this agenda is the requirement of compromise between needs and wants. Hence the idea of limitation placed on the development process in order to sustain or to improve the balance between our homocentric or nature-centric development. Sustainable development has traditionally been focused on the environmentalist framework that gives priority to the issue of ecological degradation. One can safely argue that environmental concerns are the cornerstone of sustainable development. Until recently, sustainable development was viewed solely through the lens of the environmentalist. But as the concept has matured, increasing emphasis has been placed on its interconnection to social and the economic dimensions of development. And indeed, contemporary mainstream notions of sustainable development portray it as a tri-dimensional concept featuring the interface between economic, environment, and social sustainability. Let's briefly look then at the economic dimension or economic sustainability. Munro reflects and he says, the need to strike the balance between the costs and the benefits of the economic activity within the confines of the carrying capacity of the environment or a community should not be made at the expense of intergenerational equity. Therefore, resources should not be exploited to the extent that their regenerative ability is compromised. Let's look at the social sustainability or the social dimension that relates to the maintenance of political and communal values. As we heard both speakers earlier, panel members, it also taps into the social values and norms being largely intangible because it relates to issues such as ethics, value systems, language, education, work attitudes, but also class systems, to mention a few, that influence societal relations and interaction. So sustainable social sustainability also speaks to the satisfaction of basic fundamental human needs within societies such as clothing, shelter, food. The sustainability of social needs and values alludes to the quality of growth that occurs and that needs to occur in an economy. Equity in the distribution of resources is therefore integral to social sustainability. There is a very interesting quote that I lifted from the Brundtland report in 1987, and quote, "Economic and social development should be mutually reinforcing," end of quote. My main concern and criticism emanating from advocates and theorists of sustainable development have been that economic conceptions of development are dominant and that they are particularly problematic in relation to sustainable development. For example, Gottlieb argues that some of the core problems are: 1, the failure of positivist economics to ensure the spread of these benefits reaches those members of a community who are most in need of them. Its failure to factor ecological costs, the costs of depleting stock resources, into the social debts that are being created. The third problem is the view that social welfare embodies products rather than fundamental human rights. And the final, the conventional economics inability to assess endogenous capacity for cultural, institutional, political, and ecological recovery. As such, the addition of sustainability to the development equation is reflective of a shift away from the narrow concerns of mainstream economics and modernization theories that emphasize economic growth to the direct disregard of other concerns such as the relationship between ecology, inter- and intragenerational equality, and social justice. This is very much reflected in how sustainable development became part of the critique of neoliberal development models that has come to dominate the development discourse in the late 1970s, 1980s, and the beginning of the 1990s. It is this sense of sustainable development paradigm that should be viewed not as a standalone construct, but part of the growth of a new social movement and the rising wave of discontent with conventional development theory and practice. And I think this symposium is indeed such an effective means in which we can question through active debate what are the values, what are the fundamental successes of this notion, this knowledge construct that we are working with. There is also the view that mainstream notions of sustainable development co-opt rather than challenge. For example, the new liberal economic hegemony, because it shares a similar foundational premise as hegemonic development approaches, in that it still prioritizes capital accumulation. For example, concepts like growth and efficiency remain part of the sustainable development discourse. So although the sustainability paradigm questions the limits to growth, there remains a high level of coherence with the core features of contemporary development thought and practice. As such, mainstream notions of sustainable development fall within the narrow confines of modernization theories of development, which prioritizes an image and vision of development scripted in the tenets of Western technological civilization that is often promoted as the universal or the obvious. But what it does is to legitimize so-called modern values and to delegitimize alternative value systems, thereby constructing a global cultural symmetry between the West and the rest. And this is where I would like to directly try to address the introduction of culture or cultural diplomacy into the debate or the knowledge construct of sustainable development. Because culture is very often defined very narrowly and thus made irrelevant to the wider debate. For example, in one of the few publications that makes the linkage between culture and sustainable development, the focus, quote, addressed the social and economic opportunities and requirements to mainstream investments in cultural heritage and the living arts, and it's limited to that dimension. It is on this basis that Jorks argues that the tacit acceptance of the arts and heritage version of culture has marginalized the concept of culture and denies theorists and practitioners an extremely effective tool. What he is alluding to is that there are several interpretations of the word culture. Indeed, Williams, in his seminal work, points out in his book called Culture that there are at least 4 contested definitions of culture. And let me briefly share those with you. The first example is the developed state of mind as a cultured person. Somebody is highly learned. The other one is a process of development, somebody's cultural interests, cultural activities. The third dimension is the means of these processes, as in cultures in the arts, intellectual works, prose, poetry. But the important one that I would like to focus on is culture as a whole way of life, a signifying system through which a social order is communicated, reproduced, experienced, and explored. Most usage of the word culture defines 2 definitions, 2 and 3, where it looks at culture as the arts, as a heritage, or as cultural identities. This presentation that I tried to show you earlier on, I don't know if you remember the very clear way in which these culturally diverse communities were portrayed. Definitions 1 and 2 is also interesting because it looks at practices, and I would like, for the purpose of this presentation, to rather collapse the 4 of them into a whole, simply called culture, because it's the notion for me where culture would place an emphasis on the whole way of life. And let's just take an example of agriculture, which is one of the earliest usage of the word culture. It also relates to sustainable development issue in that some agricultural practices today are deemed to be more eco-friendly than others on the account of culturally informed patterns. I give you the example: integrated farming versus slash and burn agriculture. And those who see themselves as being more enlightened on the sustainability development issues may view others as being less cultured, which has implications again for the environmentalist social movement on how it should mobilize itself. These examples are given to illustrate, ladies and gentlemen, just how pervasive the concept of culture is currently in the literature and how it impacts on notions and practices of sustainable development. The other key element worth noting is that when it comes to sustainable development, not all cultures are sadly equal. Some cultures are indeed more equal than others, depending on the political or the historical context. At the one end of the sustainable development discourse, Western science is viewed either as the cause or the solution to the problem. At the other end of the spectrum, traditional or localized, particularly non-Western knowledge, is either seen as backward, problematic, or it's romanticized as sacred wisdom, and therefore valued for its future possible values. So that we can speak of the promotion of cultural identities, cultural pluralism, cultural industries, or geocultures as key elements of what should constitute the 4th pillar of sustainable development. It refers to the need to redress urgently this global imbalance in the cultural arena. What needs to be underscored, ladies and gentlemen, is that sustainable development as practiced in the developing world today is largely informed by the Western notions and is often funded in accord with the agenda of multilateral, bilateral, non-governmental, or the philanthropic donor agencies from developing countries. There is a very clear agenda that is placed on the table. And this is viewed as problematic because it creates new dependencies for the developing world, and it raises concerns about whose agenda is being served. One analyst who's Leach, and I give you the quote, "Global environmentalism and its supportive science came to be seen as at least partly the product of particular Western-dominated cultural traditions and relations of power. The imposition of global orthodoxies and analysis over different environmental values and notions of sustainability can infringe not only on local livelihoods, but also on cultural freedom in a deeply decivilizing process." And this is where I would like to focus now for the rest of the presentation on culture, not limited only to the 4th pillar of sustainable development, but rather as an additional pillar supportive to the 4 pillars of sustainable development, because it has matured and it's opened up the debate for further reflection. And this is indeed welcomed in the fact that culture is being considered as a key element of the sustainable development framework. This perspective of the incorporation of culture into sustainable development presents a challenge, both because of the words culture and development, because both of these are highly complex in usage and interpretation. Williams, for instance, argues that culture is one of 2 or 3 of the most complicated words in the English language. He does not indicate what are the other 2 most complicated words, but it's based on his comments about development, in which he suggests that it is a good contender to be the top of the list. He cautions, though, what is often an unexamined idea of development can limit and confuse virtually any generalizing description of the current world economic order, and it is an analysis of the real practices subsumed by the development that more specific recognitions are necessary and should be possible. He then goes further and he says, for the moment, the sustainable development is when we look from the Western road to development. Development equals Western development equals modernization. The alternative is development equates to growth, equates to economic growth, equates to GDP growth. But clearly, ladies and gentlemen, we've seen it is much more complex, and there are much more urgent needs to go beyond purely the limiting financial growth. So if Galting is right, that in spite of all the various theories abound, at the core, development in theory and practice, there is still this emulation of the total Western concept. In practice, development establishes a hierarchy of knowledge and a demonstration or leading to an emulation effect that suggests that leaders know what is best for the followers, and that it is required that the followers is to apply this formula of development faithfully. How does this relate to sustainable development? As indicated earlier, the main aim of sustainable development is to strike a balance between competing and conflicting interests that are based on the dimension of intra- and intergenerational dimensions. In this regard, global inequality and the development discourse are at the forefront of the ecological problem because of the uneven growth of the emulation effect that it graduates and generates. Long Hall made the following comment, and he said, if poor nations were to consume the same amount of fossil fuels as the rich nations, this would likely result in an ecological disaster. At the same time, however, the global development demands an increase in energy consumption in developing countries, a presumption which is also expressed in the various documents of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. Now, we also know, ladies and gentlemen, that the UN did say that the science that they had put forward was fundamentally flawed. So, hence, we start again at a distinct disadvantage on that debate. When one examines, for instance, contemporary development context, there are much admiration for the economic successes of the tiger from the East, China, India, South Korea, Taiwan, which together accounts for almost half of humanity and over 70% of manufacturing added value from the South. A critical concern is that many developing countries are busy trying to catch up with many developing countries, and it raises the question whether the achievements of these countries can be emulated. Alternatively, is it attainable by other developing countries, and whether this is indeed a desirable goal, given what we know about the level of economic despolitization and the social debt that this has created in establishing these trends of growth. The point I'm trying to make is that sustainable development is integrally linked to the geocultural construct of development. The possibilities for ecologically sustainable future depends on how we manage and how we organize production cultures and consumption cultures, and that they are altered and adapted to the challenging ecological, socio-political and technological context. Sustainable development is threatened by the dominant mode of development thinking that emphasizes a growth orientation. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, there are themes that needs deeper reflection, and one is that of cultural identity, one of self-reliance, where each community relies primarily on its, and should rely on its own strength and resources. The sustainable debate, again, if we look at the slash and burn samples, we in the West, we of course we're very happy with new fuels and the palm oils, etc., but at what cost to the communities from where these projects originate? For us, it becomes a quality of life, it becomes a very advanced lifestyle, but yet for the communities where these projects originate from, what happens there? The issue of social justice. Development should give priority to the most in need. And I would like to conclude to say, ladies and gentlemen, there is an old adage, much loved in the self-help books, that says, today is the first step in the rest of our lives. If we want to change the course by a few degrees in the way that we think about the interrelationship or the interconnectedness of culture, sustainability, and development as three distinct but yet interdependent notions, it will take us to a very different place in 50 years' time from where we are sitting. If we're not going to change course, I think we all know where we're heading to. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you may have.
So I'm sure that's inspired a number of questions, and we actually have some time left over, so we can have a good debate. Yes, at the front, yeah.
You were mentioning that sustainability or the sustainable development is a Western concept. Does that really matter? Since what is sustainable for Timor-Leste, as we were hearing earlier today, is their concept, and then Switzerland can have its own. So would that really have any impact?
I think your question is very much what a lot of proponents are debating at the moment, because as we've heard the ambassador from South Africa, who said the whole debate was born in New York, and it's this notion of there are certain value systems against which these perceived concepts of how sustainability, first and foremost, which looked at the ecological dimension. Then, at a later stage, development came in. Where my criticism lies when I say the Western dimension, because it was all about bringing something to, be it product, be it services, be it whatever, to a certain community, that they would welcome it. And very often what we've seen is what we bring to these people, they've known much better than any one of these long, complex paper tigers. They've been doing that for years. And what I would like to see is, and this is most probably an unrealistic dream, but I am a dreamer, is to say that I would like to see more examples such as Timor-Leste, their thoughts, their ideas, their cultural know-how. All of us, as we sit around this table, have a cultural heritage which forms part of what I would even go as far as to say part of natural law. This is the way things are. And if we look at the tenets of this Western model, it's very limited. And that's where I'm coming back to the notion that should we just accept it? Should we just No, I'm saying let's try to include more so that its applicability can be much more dynamic, and that when we take the template and we try to put it on a country like Timor-Leste, let's not forget that Timor-Leste is also a small island development state, and the direct challenge that global warming, we know what are the results, but yet we still look at the template, right? So you want development funding, let's take the template, and I just don't think we can afford that anymore. And that's what I mean by...
So then I would say that clearly we are not sustainable, then, if that's what we do. It's not sustainable development.
Are we looking at the glass half full or looking at the glass half empty? And I would say, I think the debate is on the table, and let us continue to increase the debate, but that we introduce different dimensions, because that would ensure the sustainability, the durability based on the real tangible values, both tangible and intangible. So my answer in short is absolutely we have it, but it needs to become much more durable, and we have to be more inclusive. Not just inclusive in terms of debate, but the aspects of culture and all those complicated, diverse tenets of what constitutes culture, and hence I would dare to say, rather to turn it upside down and to say, not the top-down but the bottom-up approach, that it's a reflex, a whole change to embrace the social order, and not from a specific dimension, but rather the celebration of the rich diversity that can constitute sustainable development, instead of the limited focus at the moment that looks only at the financial growth or benefits.
Okay, do we have any further questions?
Hi, I'm Xiao Chen from China, and you mentioned about the importance of cultural identity, and I think in today's world, under globalization, American culture has flowed into almost every corner in this world. But I think maybe different, by culture, I'm not just mean the music or film, but also the norms, values such as democracy and the so-called basic human rights. But in my opinion, like different culture has its their own definition or explanation of such as beauty or human rights. So how do you think these local communities can remain their own cultural identities, regardless of the influence of America or the West? Thank you.
A very interesting question, simply because if we look at the patterns of thinking from the Western dimension, it's very much based on the Socratic values. Let's go to the point, and we have to critically debate, and we need to try to be as focused as possible. Confucius' heritage culture takes the opposite view. They say, let's look at the complexity of the situation, and by this complex, broad reflection, we would look at identifying the solution. And I think, and this is very much the contribution that I believe China is currently bringing into the whole debate, because yes, I guess we can be very critical of any government, any community, but I rather prefer to look at the glass half full and to say, already the fact that we are looking at both the Socratic and the Confucius heritage culture, to look at the contribution that everybody can bring in finding solutions. It is not just, for instance, anymore the so-called Westphalian notion of democracy or global governance that's dominating. There are several different definitions. And I think this is exactly what is this richness in the debate that needs to come forward. Another dimension which you were alluding to is the idea of groups. We need to debate with groups. Groups are dignified human beings, individuals, that are framed within the context of fundamental rights. And they must be heard, they should be heard, and their concerns should be integrated in policies, agendas, be it based on human rights, be it development, be whatever it is. There needs to be. Democracy has moved outside of the unique domain of only elected governments, parliamentarians. There is this notion of, and this is again where I think cultural diplomacy plays a very important role, because citizenry, citizenship education, all of that, participative democracy, all of these notions directly allude to what you were saying, and that we are fairly new to in the Western notion of civilization.
But as you mentioned about Chinese culture, I think comparing with other cultures, Chinese culture is relatively strong. But what about the others, like some small villages in Africa or Southeast Asia? How about them? Can their voice be heard?
Absolutely. As you know, you are our expert based on Chinese culture. Just the same, Africa. How many diverse communities and cultures suffer because you put the label Africa? And no, there is such a rich cultural tradition, heritage, which needs to be ploughed back into constructing what I would say this global debate on sustainability and development, because as diplomacy is the oil, the machine that keeps international relations going, so I believe cultural diplomacy and culture should be the oil and the machinery that can keep the two components, sustainability and development, well oiled together to produce the necessary results. The same in the Arab Gulf states, to just brandish a diverse group of nations and people. If you pull the label of a nation away, again, it's something that, based on sovereignty, that it was said, a people and its nation will be represented by one single flag and a common set of values. No, the human rights debate have brought these fundamental human rights, and we need to acknowledge those. And in China, you have so effectively shown us during the development debate, where the rural communities, how they've stood up to ensure that their voices are heard. And it's the same dynamics and the same concerns that somebody in a rural village would have. And just one final comment, and this is where I would like to salute the role of women and girls, because they are naturally responsible and tasked to carry forward the education and the cultural know-how, how to plough the lands, the production of food. And during times of war and conflict, who remains? Who has to take up that responsibility of education, of reconstructing the social fabric of a community, of a nation? It is women, and it's also today where I believe, and I dedicate my lecture to the women and the young girls of the world around the globe today, because they are the ones who are going to take us into the next century with good dose of common wisdom.
Thank you. Yeah, just one question over here.
Yeah. Dr. Coetzer, you mentioned in your presentation the word ecological sustainability, I believe. No one would argue that we'd have to have a habitable planet to make that a reality. There's been precious little discussion or mention of Fukushima. Now, there are people who assess that situation in many different ways, from a manageable one to one of utter disaster. Let's take the worst case scenario. If people are concentrating on building number 4, plant number 4, and I don't know if many people around here are aware of. Certainly, you're nodding your head like you know what I'm talking about. So we have building number 4, and in building number 4, there was an area right above the containment vessel which stores the spent fuel rods. Some of them more than 40 years old. I've heard a number of 600,000 spent fuel rods in the entire facility. That just dwarfs my understanding, to have that much material in one place. If there's an earthquake, then there's a good chance that the liquid which is used to cool those fuel rods will dissipate, evaporate, because of the tremendous heat. And as a result of that, there could be explosions, or there will inevitably be explosions, and the residue, the particulates, will be thrust into the atmosphere, and that will spread across much of the northern hemisphere. And some of the people who are talking about doomsday say that this is an ELA, or an extinction level event, which could take place at any moment. One question is, why, I'm sitting here at the UN, I have heard precious little discussion of that situation. And to me, if you're going to solve a situation, then it's incumbent upon you to know what the situation is and to have an astute understanding of the gravity of the situation. So maybe you could enlighten us as to that. The other thing is, there's this subtle suggestion that the West, and I'm from Detroit, you can't get any more West than that, in a certain sense. I mean, I was talking to some people just the other day, and Detroit was probably the richest city the world has ever known. Not anymore. But I have certainly enjoyed the fruits of what came after the Second World War. People are suggesting that, in my estimation, a system that has failed, predatory capitalism, should be the order of the day. I'd like your impressions on that statement. And I don't want to just go on and on and on, but I think that the two important points were Fukushima.
Please don't go on and on. We don't have time.
No, I won't go on and on. Okay. No, I'm just summing up. Just those two questions, the one on why is it that we are not discussing Fukushima? Is it because it's not important, it's not germane to the subject? And the other thing is, why suggest to have a system that is proven to be predatory and exploitive, plunderous, to continue?
I thank you very much for your, shall I say, confrontational, but very important contributions, because I 100% agree with you. Why are we not talking more about these environmental disaster that is a direct cause of the nuclear dangers that it holds when it goes wrong? Let me just to allude to the example of the Chernobyl disaster. As we speak, you have high percentage of cancer being diagnosed in Sardinia, as well as in Corsica, one of the French islands. And this is a fact, ladies and gentlemen. Now, and this is again where I think we have a collective responsibility, and I can't here speak as a representative of the United Nations, I can't speak as a representative of the academia, but let me put my shoes as a global citizen on here. And I think this is where we need to continue to put pressure on our community leaders, but at the same time our elected leaders, to look at alternative sources of energy. And as I was trying to allude in my presentation, is one that does not compromise on any of the so-called tangible benefits, because very often we don't look at the intangible challenges, opportunities, threats. Now, some may say that it is very cost effective to look at these type of energy supplies, to try and move away from fossil fuels. Let's take the example of Switzerland, where I'm currently living, and literally 2 weeks after the Fukushima disaster, the Federal Secretary made a decision that they will not go ahead with the further building and development of energy, atomic energy. They will go towards solar powered energy. Problem is, none of the communities where these thousands of eolians, these massive windmills need to be implanted, actually want to have it present. So that's the dynamic. What are the alternatives? And instead of going to a fait accompli solution, I think there needs to be constructive dialogue, and more dialogue. I think this is fundamental. Your issue with that you mentioned with regards to Detroit, and I appreciate, because clearly there is so much of yourself in your question. But at the same time, we measure Detroit only in terms of the monetary benefits. What about and I believe Detroit is still most probably one of the richest when you just look at the cultural richness that exists. And I think this is again important, that we tap into it, and this is where each one of us have that fundamental responsibility, not to only look at the monetary value, because if we're going to tap into all the cultural opportunities and the cultural richness that we have, yes, it will equate to a benefit, be it financially, be it whichever way you want to look at it. But I think we should also not be trapped to measure it only in economic terms. We should try to also give a value to so much of this richness that we have, but we've simply not given it any value. And in that sense, I would say, let's try and visit, and why I am so passionate and supported this symposium so passionately, because the time has come for each one of us, and why I earlier this morning said that when Mark called me the first time, that without question, I'm committed, and I will support you as much as possible. And this is my request to you, ladies and gentlemen. Please take the same, I think, urgency and this need to regenerate this debate, but in its full complexity and dimensions, back into become the ambassadors of cultural diplomacy, and the need to inject cultural diplomacy into the sustainable development debate. Otherwise, we will continue to go in circles, and we will continue to look at it in its complex parts, and we need to break the barriers, and we need to look at it as a new social order. And that's the only way we would be able to go forward. Instead of looking at it in an isolationist area, we need to integrate it as one.
Many thanks, Dr. Jon-Hans Coetzer. Thank you.